Welcome everyone to Bridge Over Troubled Water, Reimagining Grant-Making Practices in Post-COVID Era. I hope you've been enjoying the conference as much as I have. I'm Manuel, Litalien, your moderator for this session. I'm PhiLab's Ontario's Hub's co-director, along with Dr. François Bois, who is the director of Sprott Center for Social Enterprises at Carleton University. Very briefly on myself, since we've been engaged in quite active dialogue and quite personal, I'd say, along these conferences, I'll briefly make an introduction. I come from Montreal. However, from the age of 1 to 12, I already moved 22 times, so not always easy to take roots wherever I am. I've worked or is working on religious philanthropy, remote philanthropy, as well as ethnic and diasporic philanthropy. I'm an active member of the new Observatoire des droits de la personne at the Université de Montréal, so Human Rights Observatory, and my research is conducted here in Canada and Southeast Asia, pre-COVID especially, where I spend most of my time with community organizations promoting gender and ethnic minority rights. I look how these organizations are impacted by state welfare development policies. So before we start our discussion and interactions today, I would like to acknowledge the land where I have the privilege of living and working for nearly 11 years now at Nipissing University. The longest time in my life I've ever stayed in one spot, actually. Nipissing University sits on the land of the Nipissing's First Nations traditional territory and the traditional territory of Anishinaabeg under the protection of the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. If you're interested, just a small note, and a new development on this specific treaty, look at Anishinaabeg News website for the article entitled Ontario Blinks and Negotiations Begin in Historic Robinson-Huron Treaty Trial. It's dated April 18 and April 20th. So really, really recent. It's really worth your read. Now, we're very thankful today to our presenters who accepted our invitation to engage in the topic of reimagining grant-making practices. I will, in the spirit of dialogue, we'll let the presenter in a few moments present themselves and the organization they're working with. So we have today Cathy Taylor, Dr. Isabel Cascante, Andrew Chulinal. We also have Thea Bélanger. And so we do have a student reporter today as well as part of this panel, Jordan Pym, who will be helping us taking notes and making sure we systematically get everything that is being said. The presentation's format, general pointers for the session. The presentation's format is conversational. We will have at one point breakout rooms after our presenters' discussion, where each panelist will be facilitating their one breakout group. Please make sure, I'll remind you of this, but please make sure to be mindful of the time in your breakout groups. It'll be 30 minutes. And ask participants then to return to the plenary for final conclusion. Roughly 5 minutes each groups. That's what we have planned. We do have a francophone breakout groups, depending on how many we are. Those will be facilitated by myself, Jean-Marc, and David. The panel is divided in 6 different sections today. We start with a cultural component. We have then a second moment where I'll be introducing. Then we have the third section, which is a plenary and moderate, where we have a moderator, me, asking questions, specifically to every one of you. Then we will have breakout groups, and when we have a conclusion, and we end up with another cultural component. So we do have 2 cultural components today also. Now I'd like to move into the second section of our panel today. I'll briefly outline the topic and introduce the purpose of the event. So the focus of the panel's presentation will be to discuss the limitations and opportunities to grant making based on learnings from the previous 2 years, specifically focusing on tool of governments / policies. Here we're thinking of perpetuity, disbursement quota, taxes, unqualified donees, And we'll look at funders practice, which includes flexibility, application and reporting requirements, collaborations. And we will also use a social justice and equality lens when discussing the current state of play and considering effective ways forward. So I'd like at this point to invite each panelist to introduce themselves and their organization, after which I'll be asking two broad questions. Perhaps I can start with people on my screen. Andrew, could you?
Thank you, Manuel. So my name is Andrew Chinalal, and I am the CEO of Community Foundations of Canada, and glad to be on this panel with my esteemed colleagues.
Next one on my screen would be Cathy.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cathy Taylor, the Executive Director of the Ontario Nonprofit Network, which is an advocacy network for Ontario's nonprofits and charities. And I'm coming to you today from my home near Erin, Ontario, on the lands of the treaties of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the adjacent purchase. Thank you.
Next one on my screen would be Isabel.
Great. Thanks, Manuel. Really happy to be here today and be part of this conversation. I'm Isabel Cascante, Director of Research, Public Policy and Evaluation with United Way Greater Toronto. That's the lens that most of my responses will be filtered through today.
Thank you, Isabel. Next is Thea.
Ani, Bojo, hi everyone. My name is Thea Belanger. I am Anishinaabe. My mother is Ojibwe from Nipissing First Nation. My father is Maliseet from Tobic First Nation in New Brunswick. And I'm the project director for the Ontario Indigenous Youth Partnership Project, which is a small granting program created by and for Indigenous young people. I'm calling in from unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory in the city of Ottawa. And my pronouns are she and her, and I'm really happy to be here. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Thea. So the questions I'm going to be asked, I'll start with the first one. Whether it comes to funders or the state, grant-making practices and policies are established with a general purpose to improve the efficacy of philanthropic action. So these practices can refer to various aspects of the grantor-grantee relationship, including providing structure, control, and goal-oriented approach, as well as transparency and accountability in the use of common resources. Despite these initial intentions, these systems can also have a limiting impact on the effectiveness of nonprofit action. So the question to you, can you speak more to the challenges these structures pose to the ability of community organization to achieve social justice objectives? Andrew, would you like to start?
Yeah, happy to, Manuel. In your opening, you talked about, the last 2 years, and obviously we've been working and living through a pandemic. Imagine Canada, they did a survey on charities in Canada and kind of looked at where charities were before the pandemic and where they were kind of during it. And so the measurements were between 2020 and I think 2021. And high level, out of the charities that they surveyed, 8% were not operating anymore because of the pandemic. Another 78% had significant augmentation to the way that they deliver services and meet their mission. And the balance, which is about 15% or so, things kind of stayed the same. But if you're part of that 85% that had a significant change to the way that you were doing things because of the pandemic, how do you actually action that? Like, what type of resources can you put into that change? And in the Income Tax Act, it's very explicit. It says that charities must devote substantially all of their resources to charitable activities. And what's not included in charitable activities is building the infrastructure of an organization. So think about that. When there's a pandemic and it hits a charity, that's the very thing that needs to change, is the infrastructure of the organization. Corporations knew this well. You've got people working in big office towers and now they're working at home. That's a big shift in the infrastructure that's needed to support that type of change. We're no different. So when most of our funding is by law directed to the charitable purpose and not necessarily about supporting the organization's infrastructure, that can be very limiting, to your point, Manuel. The second piece of that, or the second layer, is this difference between restricted money that comes from donors and unrestricted money that comes from donors. And so at the top level, we got the CRA regulations that say got to spend most of your money on charitable activities, and substantially all is about 90%. So we're running our organizations on about a 10% shoestring. And then donors come along and they say, well, we're gonna restrict money. We're going to restrict the way that you spend money. We want it on specific projects, or we're going to tie certain strings. So what you have, it's like a funnel. Like by the time that money lands in the coffers of a charity, how it can be deployed is pretty narrow. And I think what the pandemic has demonstrated is we need more flexibility. And what we saw during the pandemic is more donors and more philanthropic intermediaries like community foundations or private foundations take the strings off and say, actually, we know that you need more flexibility because of the nature and the circumstances. The environment has changed, and we trust organizations to make the right decisions on how those funds are deployed. And that ends up, and that began the advent of trust-based philanthropy that we hear so much about. But this is new, and it's an occurrence of the last 2 years. But we need to stay with it. We can't go back to a preponderance of more restricted money, and the government needs to change that particular piece of legislation that makes it very difficult for organizations or charities to invest in themselves.
Thanks, you, Andrew. This is great. I hear lots of good points here. Especially the one on no strings attached. And trust-based philanthropy. The next, perhaps I'll give the voice to Cathy.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Manuel. And thanks, Andrew, for that opening. I think when we're thinking about the challenges that these structures pose to organizations, and I'm going to speak to from the nonprofit sector's perspective, I think we have to step back and think about how the current practices and policies came into place, who created them, when they created them, and not to paint all grant makers with the same palette, but we know that these systems have been in place for a long time and have not been equitably created from the very beginning. So I think there's issues around how the structures have been created to create best value for dollar and efficiency and all of those things that grant makers intended. And the impact and the challenges on the sector as a result have just been exacerbated in the last 2 years with COVID. So for some specific examples that I can give, and we've certainly talked to and heard from the charitable sector a lot over the last few years, is, one being the difficulty aligning or finding the perfect match between what the funder wants or what the funder prioritizes and what the organization knows their community needs, which leads to a patchwork approach to both service delivery and how funding comes. Another is, a funding practice around short-term or project-based or innovative funding, which doesn't give an organization enough time to truly test if an intervention is successful, and always trying to figure out how to repackage what they do know works. Another structural issue is the lack of investment in people. And I can't say, enough times that our sector is based on people. It's people that do the work. It's people that design the work, create the work, deliver the services, and not to prioritize good work practices, decent work practices for the people of the sector. To keep them and retain them is a critical challenge for us. And then finally, and a couple of things that will be known to everyone is, the administrative burden, the grant making practices that have been created with, multiple applications, extensive reporting requirements. The stories of make work projects that we hear, what I call make work that organizations have to do to jump hurdles to get funding is quite intense. And the issue of overhead costs. The real cost of doing business is the people. It is having a laptop. It is being able to have an office with rent. And so making sure that those are part of the grant making practices. So those are just some thoughts around the challenges that we face. And, I can speak later to what we learned, what we want to keep as a result of COVID. But what's keeping me up at night is really the struggle between, do we tweak these grant making practices? Do we tweak where they came from, or do we step back and actually transform them? Because based on the place and who and how they were created, can we actually tweak them to meet the needs of our communities, or are we at a moment of widespread transformation?
Lots to unpack here. Thank you, Cathy. I'd like to give the voice to Isabel.
Yes. Great, thanks, Manuel. Yeah, you can hear me, right? I'm going to pick up, Cathy, on some of what you just referenced, and the piece I want to, ultimately, we're really looking at that, or all speaking to that tension between trust and accountability, and knowing that there are some pushes and pulls here. But for me, just kind of building on, Cathy, what you were saying about short term, is that I think there's a lot of room for improvement if we're talking about transformational change, which is, I think, what we're talking about when we're talking about social justice. Layered in this trust accountability tension is that tension between managing or looking at a short-term horizon versus a longer-term horizon. And so really, this is the space of transformation. And this is really high-level, kind of systems level or macro level work that requires evolution, not only of the kind of cultural norms and paradigms, which is what the programs are moving forward, but also of internally our systems. And it does start with a review of those current policies, but also how we think about impact within those systems. Long-term social innovation takes time. And I think that short-termism undermines that, right? And so, we can think of processes like semi-annual or even annual reports that really are focused on program fidelity, on achievement of those specific outputs or deliverables that can actually be counter to innovation and counter to kind of that adaptation, in part because we're stuck, I think, to traditional kind of understandings of impact, whereas in longer term plays, we know that building those strong relational level connections are really critical, and often, and I know this as an evaluator, that's often not considered impactful in the same way. And so I think it's just there's work to be done to frame some of these relational level outcomes as critical and not divorced from that longer term tension. And so just kind of figuring out the right balance. I think there are practices that are emerging. I mean, Andrew, you referenced the flexibility and some of the changes. We need to make sure that we're evaluating those and trying to really unpack the impact so that we're creating the evidence base to support further work in this way.
Again, lots. Thank you so much, Isabel, for your insight. Thea, you're next on my list.
Miigwech, and miigwech everybody for sharing. Actually, I wanted to just clear up where I'm sort of coming from in terms of my context. So for OIP, which I'll call it OIP from now on because our name is very long, but we're a very grassroots organization, right? So I'm hearing a lot of things that pretty much everybody has said that we have been putting into practice now since 2014. So from an Indigenous perspective, we created this granting program that in some ways participates in traditional granting practices, but also has thrown out a lot of them in a context of trying to ensure that we're putting the people we're serving first, right? So it's Indigenous youth. And so putting that mindset, those experiences at the forefront of how we work. And also, we tend to spend a lot of time each year evaluating things. So I heard flexibility as being something that was said. I heard, values and things are very important. Those are things we've actually been putting into practice just in a small scale. And I think it kind of ties into a lot of these larger scale issues around qualified donee status. That is something that we come into an issue every single year. We're working with and trying to serve Indigenous young people. So the context of their work is really about, well, what do you want to do in your community? What do you see as being needed? And it's my job as a funder to meet them where they're at and figure out how I can do that and serve them the best way that I possibly can. We're also governed and run all by Indigenous people. So every single youth advisor is Indigenous, and our whole steering committee is also Indigenous. So when they're applying they know that they're being reviewed by peers who understand who they are from a cultural standpoint. And also, the language makes a huge difference, right? So how we approach things and how we explain and how we talk about the kind of work we're trying to do. We're trying to build partnerships very specifically in relationships and providing skills to these young people to then be prepared or better prepared to enter into the philanthropic sector, which can be full of jargon, it can be really scary, and it can be very exploitive. So that's kind of just some of my thoughts and hearing everybody's, contribution to the conversation. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from in my perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for Miigwech, for sharing. So we have plenty of time, by the way. We have until almost 1 o'clock. And so don't be afraid to dig deeper into your own experience. The next question I have on the list is, how have grant-making practices and policies changed through the COVID-19 pandemic? And what can we learn from this experience for creating a justice-oriented system of community action?
Mm-hmm.
So, Andrew, would you like to take the ball?
Sure, happy to, Manuel. I just have to say before I get into my answer, being on this panel with Cathy and Isabel and Thea, there's so many progressive and forward-thinking ideas are already coming out, and I often find myself in these conversations where I see that, and then I think about like how the change is happening at the regulatory level and who's in charge of that, and it's not people with these ideas, and so I'm sitting with that dichotomy and that ambivalence. Because it's a thing in the sector. There are gatekeepers, and they are the ones that are that government's listening to. And yet we get to a wonderful event like this with a great panel, and I wonder where those folks are. Are they listening to us? Because they're talking about something completely different than the things that we're talking about. And I think ultimately we got to fix that problem. I don't know how to do it. Cathy, maybe you've got better ideas than I do. I was reading a Future of Good publication. It's a story that actually went viral maybe about a month ago. And they talked about the Right Collaborative. And I don't know if my panelists read this story, but what it was a group of Indigenous women, and in the article they called them aunties. What they said is, hey, if you're going to fund anything in our community or communities, you have to apply to us, right? You just don't get to write a check and walk away and declare victory. We have to determine whether we're going to set the bar, and we're going to determine whether you can meet or exceed that bar. And so this is about, what they call decolonizing the philanthropy, or decolonizing wealth, if I take some jargon from Edgar Villanueva. So it shifts the paradigm. It puts community back in the driver's seat. And I think this is an important example because there's opportunity for something like this to go to scale. And when you're working in a philanthropic intermediary like the ones that I represent, it causes us to really take note, because what we need to do is we need to be really good funders. But oftentimes, because of our own bias, of our own blind spots, and the fact that we haven't built those relationships yet with equity-seeking groups or with Indigenous groups or the Black community, as an example, and because those people aren't typically in our organizations or on our boards or hold that power, it forces us to look at these opportunities in a very different way. And I think that's something that we have to, it's something I'd like to see proliferate in the sector much more than it has. I think the other thing is, one of the organizations I work closely with is the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund. And they took the model of participatory granting to the next level, which is, sitting there with the capital and the resources, but going to community. And instead of using a grants committee that's internal, use the community as a way to determine how you're going to allocate resources and how you're going to determine success. And that's a way to democratize the philanthropy, but also the decision-making process. So now community kind of owns and is accountable, for what it's doing. The other thing here, and this goes to the budget, the most recent federal budget. And so, we're still sort of waiting for certainty on some of the things that came down, but one of them was the ability to fund non-qualified donees. And Thea referred to this in her comments, which is, what if you're not a registered charity? And there's good reason for why a lot of groups cannot be registered charities, because that requires a lot of resources and effort, and things that some communities can find an impediment. However, it shouldn't discount the level, the quality, the level, and the effectiveness of the work that they're doing. And I'm also curious to see how many organizations, philanthropic intermediaries, will actually start to flow money through non-qualified donees, subject to whatever the rules might be as we learn about them. Because that has been the excuse. And I'm using that word intentionally, excuse. But when you remove the excuse, will it change anything? And I think that remains to be seen. Mark Bloomberg pulled some data, less than 0.1 of 1% of funding from philanthropic intermediaries go to Indigenous organizations. And the same is true for the Black community, and unfunded outlines that as well. So we're now going to remove a lot of these regulatory barriers. Will it actually change anything? I'm hopeful it will, but we might find out other things about ourselves that we don't like either.
Thank you, Andrew, for this great shaking the box. I like it. Anyone else? Cathy, you're the next one on my screen. Do you want to connect?
Sure. I so appreciate Andrew's comments, because I think what COVID has shown us is that there are ways that we can change the systems. And yet when we change the system, as Andrew said, will things change? Because we have practices and biases in place, and we don't have the excuse of the system. I mean, that's such a great question for us to really wrestle with. I think if I go back, Manuel, to your question about, what has changed in the pandemic and what do we want to see stay the same or different, there's a few things that we've noticed. We did 3 surveys during the pandemic of the sector. The last one had almost 4,000 responses. So we heard a lot from nonprofits and charities and grassroots groups in Ontario. And, one of the things that changed during the pandemic is that we learned that government can act quickly, that, when there's a crisis, when there's a need, we learned during these last 2 years that government can get money out the door. They can get a program going within a month or 6 weeks. They can accommodate emerging needs and emerging issues. And although these programs weren't perfect, for sure, they were a start. And I think that has led us to perhaps reflect on, we know that public policy change and advocacy is a long game, but the government can move quickly when it wants to. And so I think our expectations of how government works should change as a result. We should expect them, going forward, to move faster, to be more responsive, to be more innovative, and ensure that community is at the center of their decision making. So I think that's one thing that's changed, that I hope we don't go back to saying, oh, of course it's government, it'll take forever. Instead saying, we actually expect you to do this, and we expect you to do it more quickly and more transparently. I think the other thing that has changed during the pandemic has been the growth of, or the development of, more trust-based philanthropy practices, and understanding the need for organizations to be strong. And there was nothing as clear as the first months of the pandemic, when organizations, it was so clear that organizations that had reserve funds, for example, were able to get through even the first 3 or 4 months without worrying about how the money was going to come in. And organizations that didn't have reserve funds were in trouble very quickly. And some of the reasons they didn't have reserve funds was that their funders wouldn't allow them to have reserve funds, or their boards didn't think it was important, or donors don't like to contribute to reserve funds, and governments certainly don't. And so, but we expect that small businesses, have reserve funds and lines of credit and all of those types of things. So we also learned that governments and foundations and funders can figure out how to get money to communities quickly as well. And without those strings attached that Andrew said. So we saw so many examples of foundations and funders creating COVID support programs very quickly, getting money out the door very quickly, even $5,000, $20,000, even higher. And it really helped organizations to be able to meet their community's needs in the moment, whether that was providing food or keeping a safe place open, such as a shelter, or even the arts and culture and sports organizations who were closed to the public, to make sure that they didn't lose years and years. In some cases, one sports organization we talked to had been around 100 years and were on the verge of bankruptcy for the first time in 100 years. Because there was no registration fees or sponsorships for the entire cycle, which they had never anticipated would ever be, something that they'd have to face. And I think part of the learning was that we learned that it was okay to invest in technology. In fact, the organizations that had laptops and cloud-based computing also were able to pivot quickly. So why wouldn't funders or foundations or governments allow us to include technology as part of our grant application? So we learned that, and funders learned that, I think. And that's something that for sure we want to see continue. We also learned that our people, as I mentioned earlier, are our greatest strength. So trying to keep our people, create safe workplaces for them, policies for them to stay safe and take care of their families during the pandemic was of paramount purpose. And just that flexibility in funding. I can say that, I've been an executive director for 21 years in the sector. And this was the first time in my entire career. I had 3 funders in the first half of the pandemic come to me and say, we've approved some funding for you. Do whatever you need to do with it just to keep open so you don't have to worry about cash flow, because we know what you need to support the sector. And I'm not too proud to say that I cried. Like, I have never had that kind of, I'm going to cry now thinking about it, like that trust to say, whatever you need, just take it, figure it out, so that you can provide the support that you need. And I think, can you imagine if we had that trust relationship as a whole sector, and what that would mean for our ability to serve our communities? Like, it brings out so many opportunities and options. And it did allow us to be creative and innovative and do what we needed to do in the period that we had. So I do think that when we think about what we learned during the pandemic, there's so much that we don't want to lose. And unfortunately, I am seeing a bit of a shift back already. And like, how do we stop that? And how do we stop and say, wait a second, remember, you realize that reserve funds were important. You realize that digital infrastructure and our people were important, that flexibility, the world didn't fall apart when you didn't require a report due by a certain date, or, we didn't meet our output targets because, the world was, in chaos. And we still, we're all okay. And so we need to capture those stories and those learnings so that we don't slide backwards. And I think there's a huge opportunity for nonprofits and charities to actually stand up as part of this, part of this reframing and transformation, and say, actually, we're not going to do it anymore. Like, we're not going to play that game. And the obligation for funders and intermediaries and grant makers are to say, we've got to learn from this experience and let's figure out what works best. So lots to build on, I think.
Thank you, Cathy. Isabel?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Manuel. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to pick up on a few things. I've been taking notes, Andrew and Cathy, as you've been speaking. So the first thing, Cathy, when you talk about expectations for government, I think the same is true about funders. And so there are now more, and I think deeper expectations of funders, both within, I can say, being on the funder side of the table now, within organizations as well as of others. And so that, I think, has propelled and is leading to really demands for more trust-based philanthropic practices, and you both talked about that. We know, for instance, at United Way, we released, I think it was last year, our Reconciliation and Equity Action Plan, and it's available on the website. I don't think that would have happened pre-pandemic. I think that the learnings and the awareness of the inequities, not only in society and kind of in general, but in funding practices, has propelled organizations like United Way, and we're not the only ones doing this, who are setting targets around becoming a more equitable funder. And I say becoming because it's going to be a long journey. For us to get exactly to where we want to be, and there's going to be moments of reflection. We're reflecting now, and we're when we come back to it. I mean, I don't say we come back to it. I think that it's a constant piece of our work. But as we progress and move forward, we're constantly going to have to be learning and maybe adapting some of what those targets and goals are that we're setting for ourselves. So that is critical. Cathy, picking up on what you are saying about learning is so critical to, constantly, but even more so in times of crisis. And so I think that, we're right now actually doing some research, some case studies, and working with some of our PhiLab partners on this harvesting social service sector innovation during COVID. We know that the flexibility, some of those trust-based philanthropic practices, is what has enabled agencies to do things differently, because they haven't been bound to projects that maybe no longer make sense, or processes that no longer make sense. And so what we're learning in some of this research that we're doing and having lots of great conversations with agencies is, whether it's accelerating plans for a digital transformation and a shift to hybrid model, whether it's coming together with unexpected partners and breaking down silos that have existed for really decades, developing new programs and decolonizing some of our practices. Agencies are filling gaps by maximizing this existing knowledge, maximizing expertise through partnerships. And again, I know I spoke about this a little bit earlier on, but those relational level connections are so critical to all the work that we're doing. And then the final piece, and I think, Cathy, you referenced this as well, is and of course, this is part of my role at United Way, is the importance of evaluation. general operating support, we've heard from agencies how important it is to have that flexible funding. My team did a bit of a brief trying to just kind of, I don't know if we need to create a case for it or not, but we wanted to understand what's the research evidence out there, and there's a bit, but there's not really a great deal of evidence. And so while there's been that shift and that openness, others have mentioned this already, it feels like there's a turning point, and we may turn down the wrong road in terms of kind of reeling in some of that flexibility. So part of what we're thinking about is like, what is the kind of the research evidence, the evaluation evidence that we can be mining now to help really bring that, elevate the value of some of these trust-based philanthropic practices.
Thank you, Isabel. This was, again, fantastic. Lots of material to hopefully in the breakout rooms, and if we'll be able to elaborate further. Thea, I would love to hear how you connect with this.
Oh yeah, my hands are like sweaty because I'm just like I'm here for this conversation. So again, just to kind of go back to some of this trust-based ways of sort of working, right? Like from our perspective and the way that we have tried to steward and support our youth through their grants over many, many years now has really been from an intuitive space. So our practices are around, even application to reporting. They don't look traditional in any sense. They're really about ensuring that we're building relationship and not asking them to prove whether or not they're doing what they said that they did. Because we know that what they're doing is important and we know that they care about it. And so it's been about relationship building from the start and understanding who they are as humans and their communities. And oftentimes we have youth that we're working with that are from similar communities or the same communities. And even having that knowledge base is really important in understanding sort of where they're coming from and also how we can provide better support. So through some of the things that we did learn and we did change over the last couple of years through COVID has really been about, purchasing technology and understanding that, while we're not actually going to be hosting a gathering, which is something that we typically do every year, we host a gathering, we bring all of our grantees together. We weren't going to be able to do that. So it's going to be online. But there was so many times that I could just hear people around saying, oh, well, just go online. And that makes no sense to a person who is living in a rural or remote community. So if I'm going to expect our grantees to attend a gathering online, well, I need to provide them the tools that they need to get there. It's my job. I need to figure that out and I need to support them in that. So we bought laptops, and that wasn't part of their grant, so that they're not losing funds on any of that because their project is important. And we're talking about micro grants, right? So we go up to about $10,000, which is a lot, but it's also not a lot at all. And we need to, make sure that we're thinking about where they're coming from and how they connect to that, and that they are in charge of their funds of how they want to and need to spend that, whether that's on food, elders, honorariums, whatever that might be, and in equipment. That's something that we had to really change our thinking around in terms of if they're going to host a cultural revival program, part of that is going hunting. And they're going to need equipment to go hunting. They're going to need to have tents. They're going to need to have, you name it. And we need to be sure that we're okay and understand that so that we can support them in getting to that space, because there aren't a lot of opportunities to be able to apply to grants that actually do those, and recognize the importance of having actual materials and equipment that they need in order to sort of conduct their programs. The other thing I found really interesting, so we create this experience for our youth, right? We create this experience by talking about why we don't ask for traditional reports. We ask them to tell us a story, what they did. Do you need help? Do you want to write it in, did you create a Facebook account or an Instagram account, or did you write a journal? And do you want to share that with me? You tell me what you want to share, and I'm cool with that. that's really great, because I just want to make sure that you're doing okay. It's not about whether they're checking off all of the boxes. It's about whether or not they feel comfortable and confident in their projects and they're executing in the ways that they need to, because we've also realized that over time we need to be flexible. Sometimes they're not going to happen when we expect them to. And it's my job to be okay with that when they haven't been able to conduct their project for over a year because of COVID restrictions. They haven't been able to leave their reserve, or they haven't had internet access, or any of those multiple things that could happen. But on the flip side, while we're a small funder, we also in a constant state of fundraising. So I build relationships and I have relationships with other funders. And the interesting part about that is that we give the youth this experience, but us as a organization still are playing that game. And it was really interesting to have been in relationship with so many of our funders that we've had for years now, who understand who we are, they're invested, to come back to us and say, don't worry, you don't have to report this year, because we get it, we understand, we trust you. And first I was like, yeah, like that's awesome. But also I was like, so you didn't trust me before. And do you know how much time it takes for us to go through that reporting process? It's a lot of time. I feel like a majority of my time as the director is applying for grants and reporting on those grants. There's a huge amount of time that goes into all of that. And then I'm like, who's reading it? Are you reading it? Does it really matter? Like, I get, just to a certain level, there definitely needs to be some checks and things, but it was really interesting to be like, oh, so in this moment it's fine, but are we going to go back to that? Like, hopefully we can start pushing back against what those practices look like. Some of the things that we've started to do, we started a podcast actually to start to speak to some of these experiences that young people have in entering a relationship with funders. But also as a way to kind of say, like, here's the story in an oral setting, and you get all the information that you could possibly need in that one podcast episode. Do what you want with it. If you want to transcribe that and it makes you feel better to have a written report, cool, but we're going to tell you the story instead, because it makes way more sense to us in terms of, passing on knowledge and sharing our learnings and, providing information on what it is that we've been up to. We're also going into a space of pushing back, of saying, here's a visual report, a creative piece that you can look at that tells you the same story, without having to, make anybody go through a whole load of questions that actually don't make any sense to what it is that you're actually doing as a small organization. So those are just like, what I'm kind of like picking up and thinking about, and what we're kind of exploring, and how we're trying to share back some of that information with the sector, of saying, like, these are the things that don't serve us. These are the things that don't make any sense to us. And if you're able to, hopefully you're able to question those things too, and be in a constant state of questioning of whether or not those community people, whoever it is that you're looking to serve, that you're actually including them in that process of actually asking those questions and then implementing them. Every single staff person, I think, in all of our organizations, need to have an understanding of exactly who they are, what their role is in playing into those programs that they're actually trying to support. Because if they have no connection and have no idea who they are and how they connect to that, it's just a job. And we need to start to pull away from some of those things and make sure that we're integrating a human connection to all of this kind of work, because it goes very deep. At the end of the day, I don't get to stop being Indigenous at 5 o'clock. My work bleeds into all of my life. And that is true for so many small grassroots organizations.
Thank you, Thea. I feel like there's a lot of very deep material here that we can provide reflection on in the breakout room, which is actually happening in a minute. I don't know if any of you have heard of a concept, and I'd like to bring it now, but I only have a minute. There's a movement in the US, apparently, where foundations are called Cette, Sunset Foundation, Sunset, where within the endowment, some foundations are created and they're a beginning and there's an end. And so apparently it's a thing that is looked at a little bit on the Canadian side, but I don't think we have time here. I'm just throwing that in, so perhaps we can think about this as we're moving into our breakout rooms, because this is the time now. We will have a link provided to us. I think you can go in the
So
email
maybe I
sent by
can. So
Jean-Marc.
Manuel, maybe
Yeah.
I can give some technical elements. So for the people that are attending the conference, on your screen you see there's a on the upper side it's a place to go back to the lobby, and when you go back to the lobby, there's the possibility of choosing the breakout rooms. And when you click on the blue button on breakout rooms, you will have on the breakout rooms with the name of the people that will do the animation. For example, Andrew, Cathy, Isabel, Thea, names appear, but also Manuel for the francophones people, Manuel, Jean-Marc, and David. I will say David, but it's David. So we have three sorry, we have 3 francophone rooms and 4 anglophone. And so with Andrew, Tia, Isabel, and Cathy. So that's the way you can do the best way to move from where we are now to the breakout rooms. I think I hope I was clear.
Please remember the breakout rooms are for 30 minutes. That's what we have for discussion. And I would really appreciate if whenever you like the interactions, the chat would be helpful if intervention are put it in the chat. So that we have a document of what's happening. We do have people who will be helping you, like note takers in each breakout room as well. So you don't have to be concerned too much about that. So when we come out in 30 minutes, we have like a little debrief on what happened in the. It'd be nice if we had some sort of kind of a list of things that we've discussed, and how do we keep that list alive as we move ahead. Are we clear? I think Catherine sent you also the link on your email. So I'll see you in 30 minutes. Merci. Thank you, everyone, for agreeing to be part of this great chat. I know I enjoyed my time. I had reconnected with long-time lost friends, I suppose. So now it's the conclusion. We will, and I will invite every panelist to summarize the discussion, offer a bit of concluding remarks and future point of action. And of course, the note taker in each room can definitely help. So I would like to start with Andrew, if you don't mind. You're the one on my screen. That's the beauty with having an A in your name, Andrew.
You keep picking on me, Manuel. I thought you and I were friends.
We are.
Well, yeah, I'm happy to kick things off. We had a really good discussion. It felt like we were just starting to have the discussion, actually. And so I know that obviously you can use more time and cover lots of ground, but I think we covered 2 sort of broad topics, and I'm going to impute some other stuff into that as well. But we talked about donors. We had somebody in our group that works in a large financial institution and works with high net worth individuals and works with those individuals in terms of how they can activate their philanthropy. And so interesting questions are coming up in 2022 with donors, and talking to them about how they want to deploy their resources, the use of private foundations or public foundations, or even moving money directly to end source. What that might look like in the context of the mechanics of administrative fees and due diligence and accountability, et cetera. It really does sort of bring the context of justice in an interesting way to philanthropy, because when we talked about it in the larger group, like justice is also understanding how wealth has come to be. Where does wealth come from? The source of it, the land, the environment. How was that accumulation possible? And does it then inform the philanthropist, who is now the holder of that wealth, what they should do, or how they should activate it? And so that's not always been the case. And Darren Walker, who's the president and CEO of the Ford Foundation, has the Moving from Charity to Justice book that's out. And so we're seeing that there's a lot of take there. The other big topic that we covered is just writ large governance. And we talked about the federal budget increase and disbursement quota, what that really means. And if there is more spending, more funding from philanthropic intermediaries, where's it actually going to go? Will it be more money into universities, big hospitals that have these massive fundraising teams, lots of brand, lots of presence, or the well-branded charities that have development teams and market budgets and things like that? Or will the additional spending end up with groups that have traditionally been unfunded or left out of philanthropy, or that philanthropy doesn't have a relationship with? And there's some skepticism around that, understandably so. But those are the two areas that we covered, and probably a few other things as well. But I'll pause there.
Thank you, Andrew. Wow, very rich. Cathy, you're the next one on my list.
Well, we had a very small but mighty group chatting about grant-making practices and about nonprofits' experience. And maybe a couple of highlights would be, we talked about the, we're in a bit of an experimentation phase right now. Perhaps the crisis allowed grant makers to have time to experiment and do things differently. And so how do we learn from that and continue that? And do we need some sort of infrastructure or checklists or standards or supports for grant makers to do things differently? And I know in the US, there's GEO, the Grant Makers for Effective Organizations. And so, like, how do we make that connection, build that ecosystem here in Canada? And from the nonprofit and charitable perspective, we talked about that, there's so many organizations, half of our sector is completely volunteer driven. So they, how do we support them to either push back against grant making practice, or half the time they don't know what they don't know. And so, what is that nonprofit boot camp? Where are those sources of information? How do we help organizations understand the landscape of philanthropy in Canada? So there's some real accessibility issues around what we do have available, and we also talked about the disconnect sometimes between what research is being done and then who is actually activating the research and who is actually doing the change making that needs to happen. And do we have a robust enough ecosystem to know that, if PhiLab or, an academic institute does this great research, is someone going to then say, oh, it's my job to take that and make change and try and change the system? And it's pretty ad hoc in Canada. One of the expressions that I love is relentless incrementalism. It takes us sometimes a long time to get change made. And incrementalism is not such a bad thing, but there are times when it's just not good enough. And I think now is one of those times. So we had an interesting conversation.
Thank you, Cathy. Yes, I can see that this was quite inspired. Isabel, you're the next one on my screen.
Yeah, great. We also had a small group. We were talking about reimagining funder practices, and really kind of just looked at the two kind of sides of the process, the applications, and of course the reporting structures. And so on the kind of front end discussion, there was discussion around how partners can work better together, and maybe through partner alliances help particularly smaller organizations by co-funding them, by making it a seamless singular application, by providing some networking opportunities and kind of capacity building opportunities for organizations. On the reporting side, just kind of discuss some alternative approaches, and something that I hadn't heard of before, but one of the participants noted their organization is shifting to optional reporting and really just giving the agencies the option to report if they want to, not report if they don't want to. If they want to, it could be repurposing a report for a different funder, or maybe an oral narrative or a video. And so really putting that in the hands of the agencies who know best how they want to and should be telling the story. So that is great. We recognize that there are tensions there because, of course, funders have responsibilities as well and need to then report out to donors if that's the model that they use. And so so there's that, but also, and this was really important in the conversation, was like capturing the learnings. You don't want to cut that out of the system because that's so critical. And so, if it's not a report that has to be due on a certain day every year, maybe there could be some, I'm going to get the right language here, some learning cohorts that could be developed, bringing together some of the different grantees or agencies to learn from one another, to share that way. And of course, funders can be at the table to learn alongside people. And so I think the report, particularly on the reporting end, just want to make sure that we're not losing the collective learning and the knowledge mobilization that I think, Cathy, you were actually just referencing with your final example as well.
Thank you for that rich summary. Thea, you're next. I'd love to hear what you wrote. Miigwech.
Yeah, we had a couple of sort of similar themes. We talked a little bit about, application process. And sort of resistance to change in organizations, of like there being this sort of inheriting of a process and application, and really not ever taking the time to assess whether or not the questions are relevant anymore, to assess whether or not it's serving them, and how oftentimes that's actually just passing the burden down onto the applicant, and it's not falling onto the hands of the organizations or the funders of being like, actually, maybe you should be reevaluating if you what you're looking for in this and how you're actually trying to serve these the groups of people that you're looking to serve. And so we kind of explored a little bit of that, and then we also explored and talked a bit about complacency and being comfy in our roles in our organizations, and how it kind of led to, I think it was something that I said about not being able to be I live my work beyond my work hours, and that is not oftentimes the same for a lot of folks that work within the sector and often deal with and work with Indigenous communities, BIPOC communities. And so there's this choice aspect to things of whether or not you participate or not, and that oftentimes that's just really a showcase of privilege. So we just kind of explored a little bit of the need for a more personal understanding of the work that we're doing and how we connect back to that. And that was pretty much it.
That's great. On the French side, David, did you want to summarize, or I can give an attempt and you can complement? I don't know if David is part of the. We kind of started off the panel with introducing ourselves, so there was quite a nice variety of folks. We were looking at one of the topic that, like, they echo a lot of the challenge that the team that we covered in the plenary session. How do we convince the administration? Perhaps there's a bigger role. We talked about the bigger role the politics could play. So how, For example, one of the themes that we looked at is we loved the human, like the centering back to the human variable that Thea mentioned about the podcast. So the challenge of reporting was actually mentioned in our group, the different way to report. So we talked about the norms, so existing norms that are actually barriers to some of the organizations' missions. So how can we change that? And so one of the point that was raised was who are the gatekeepers? We want to clarify. We use terminology sometimes that are quite useful, but not necessarily precise. And if you want change and activism, we need to perhaps have names. So where are they? Those gatekeepers, those people who are protectors of the norms that we want to change and to operate a transition. Another point that was talked about was the distortion between the donation and the people of the community, which are benefiting from the donations. And so there's sometimes a strong distortion. And then how do we bridge these so that we erase those distortions? So we mentioned a bit about participatory granting. One interesting point was mentioned also about the size of the organization. That is sometimes a challenge in itself, because if you're required to connect with your own money, not to connect, but to provide your own share, when you're applying, and 30% of the grant you're going to receive, you need to full front 30% of $1 million, for example. Well, for a small size organization, they don't have that capacity to contribute up to that level. And so that is sometimes a big obstacle. And so there seems like if we want to talk about social justice, perhaps we should talk about the size of the organization. Why does size matter in our ecosystem? And so, and again, going back to the idea of perhaps on the travail de fond, we say in French, so going deeper, how do we look at the social acceptability? Who should be working to promote certain areas that should be modified or changed or reform? And the importance of research was also, which was refreshing to hear. So the collaboration between the ecosystem and researchers to understand, build data and knowing a bit, but how do we use those data? Who's using it? Because sometimes PhiLab may produce great work, but who's implementing the work that we're doing? Who's responsible of pushing through and making sure that the right the gatekeepers hear the work that we're all doing together, our partnership work, right? And so that were some of the main themes. David, if you want to complement, I think on my end, that's the note I had for a panel. Hopefully the panelists will recognize what they've talked about. David, are you there? Can you act? I don't think we can hear you. If not, I'd like to, again, David n'est pas ici avec nous. Wow, mon Dieu. Okay, I hear it. That was very clear. I will now bring this panel to an end. We did quite an overview. I think there's a lot of material we're bringing home today. I'd like to express a warm thanks to Andrew, Cathy, Isabel, and Thea for being here today and for enlightening us with a lot of the realities of the what's going on in the ecosystem.